So, Woman of the Hour, directed by Anna Kendrick, is all about the 1970s serial killer known as Rodney Alcala. Now, what I love so much about this type of, because the thing is, like, a serial killer type film, it's like, a true crime thriller. This feels like a film that it could just, it could just get lost in the investigation. It could just focus specifically on the kills and try to find like the motivation, and the audience is expected to play detective throughout. But we've gotten so many of these like true crime stories here that, like I was a little bit weary coming into this film. But I think what's fascinating about this film is that the way that Kendrick directs it is that she has a good eye to make this type of film focus more on the societal aspects that would fuel this type of killer, rather than finding like the simplistic motivation for why he did it, and why this dude throughout the 1970s proceeded to kill multiple women. Some that, like, there's only like a handful that were confirmed. It's believed that he killed many more throughout the decade. And he was known as, I believe he's known as like the dating game killer, because he went on the dating game with one of his victims that he tried to assault. So Rodney is played by Daniel Zavato. And the film opens with one of his kills. So we know that he's a photographer who lures women in. He gets them cornered, gets them alone, and waits for his moment to strike when he knows like he can get away with it. So we know he's bad news, but the person who doesn't know that he's a serial killer is Cheryl Bradshaw, who's played by Anna Kendrick, who is a struggling actress in late 70s LA. She can't find any work. She's just struggling to find a job and just doesn't have anything on her plate. And her last chance to get her name out there is to appear on the dating game as a woman who's going to interview three bachelors to decide who she's going to date. And among all three of them, Rodney seems like the better one. Like, he gives like the correct answers. He gives the answers that don't feel like they're stumbling to be progressive or just, trying to be like sexual and trying too hard to come on to her. Like the first bachelor is just an uncertain guy who doesn't know how to talk to women. Bachelor number 2 is just kind of like a scummy guy who tries to, say all the sleazy stuff that he thinks women likes to hear. And Rodney is just like that perfect manipulator of realizing, this is how you impress women. This is how you lure them in. I'm going to lay this trap. And even though Cheryl doesn't know this, she's not entirely clueless. Like, she knows how predatory men can be. She's given all the warning signs from a few other women. Like, in particular, she connects the most with like the makeup women on the dating game show who talk to her very frank and openly and tell her that, look, it's not so much about, who's the best guy to date. It's about who's the least dangerous. And by that logic, just based on, the way that she talks with Rodney, it seems like he's the least dangerous. And the film is like, the way that this movie is filmed, like, it darts between Rodney's various kills, like before and after this dating game, and the dating game itself, where Cheryl is slowly asking these questions and doesn't realize that Rodney's a serial killer. And it perfectly parallels the way that women get lured in here. So in a sense, you're watching Rodney set this trap, but it's a trap that's also like, it's fueled by that society as well. Because like the dating game, it's hosted here by Ed Burke, who, like, more or less is like Jim Lang from the dating game. He's played by Tony Hale, who, when the camera's around, he's like, yes, like, it's a wonderful dating game here. You're going to pick out among these men. And when the cameras are off, he's just like, God, like, don't step over my lines. Don't play this up for fun. And just, he really hates that Cheryl goes off script and starts asking more frank questions that women would like to ask on the dating game. So there's this intriguing aspect, I think, where Cheryl feels like she's taking ownership, where like she is being more vocal about like her agency and like posing these tougher questions to the bachelors, which is fascinating. But at the same time, like, she's still getting caught up in this trap, where it feels like no one can help her. This is especially true for the character of Laura, played by Nicolette Robinson, who is someone who realizes that Rodney is a serial killer. And she's in the audience at the dating game, and she tries to find a way to get someone to help. Like, get someone who's working on the show to track him down. They won't help. She tries to go to the police. They won't help. And it's just bitterly frustrated that there are so many of these societal aspects that are allowing the serial killer to still function and still be out there. And that eventually, by the time he gets caught, it's just like it's a breath of relief. In fact, I love the way that film ends on that note. It ends with the last potential victim of Rodney just escaping, calling the cops, and then watching from a distance as the cops come, force him to the ground, and get the handcuffs on him and throw him into custody. And she just takes that moment to kind of like breathe in, and just, they cut before you can let that breath out. And I love the way that it cuts too, because like it cuts like right at that moment where just like it's like, are they getting? Yes, they are. And then it cuts, and then you hear yourself just breathing out that relief, like, oh, finally, this guy got caught. Like, he's not gonna keep doing this anymore. But just like the way that the way that the movie is shot, like, I love that it's focusing on all just like the tense moments of dialogue, because even after the dating game, like Rodney and Cheryl, they do talk for a bit, and you can sense there's that tension where you're just waiting. You're waiting for that moment where he's gonna talk her further and further into this trap, and then eventually close in on her. And there's just this remarkable tension where even when even when like they're in a populated area and he's not going to kill her in that moment, you can sense that it's coming. That that you're just like you're like in that mode of like of a horror movie. You're like, get out of the house, get out of that relationship. This isn't going to work. You're going to die. And it's like, but it's one of those things where it's like you can understand from her perspective. He seemed like the better man in that situation, and it turns out that it really isn't, because there's so much more lurking under the surface there. But the way that Kendrick chooses to focus on like those key aspects, I think, is a benefit of how she frames so much of this film, where it's more about the conversations than it is the kills. Because every time that there are a few scenes where we do see Rodney kill somebody, but they're always from a distance. You always see them, like the first kill, like is in the middle of the desert, but you see it from inside the car from a far distance away. Another kill is in an apartment, but you see it from the roof, looking downward from the glass, where you feel like you're a helpless bystander, just watching these horrifying things happen off to the side and not being in that moment. And I think what's fascinating about that angle is that in doing so, Kendrick kind of like forces the audience to question how much we pay attention to a serial killer when we're not in that moment. Because because we can look from like a distance and judge, but once the kill happens, like, we don't see it in vicious detail. We're looking at it from afar. And that's a questioning more of like, how much do we think about the kills when we're not directly there, when we're not involved. Even when Rodney gets arrested, there are a few close-ups, but from the perspective of the victim, she's far enough away where she doesn't have to be right there. So there's a distance placed between the kills and what leads up to each, basically, what leads up to every demise, and a notch in the belt for like the serial killer. That it's fascinating to kind of like question the distance and what leads up to that moment. What are the most fascinating aspects of like the 1970s patriarchy that would boil over into that moment of murder, and it doesn't give an easy response. Like it basically mostly asserts that there are all these contributing factors, and they just kind of bubbled and boiled to a point where it doesn't so much matter what Rodney's motivation was for killing these women. It's that he could. It's like he was able to set the trap. He was able to get away with it, and there were so many societal factors that allowed him to do this and feel like he could do it. to such a degree that I think it makes for a more interesting dissection of this type of serial killer, rather than like a simplistic investigation of like, where was the motive here, and how many women did he kill? Like the specifics are not that intriguing so much as the drive for these types of characters. So yeah, just on that like boiling tension and the focus on like, edge of your seat dialogue, I think Kendrick's film is an astounding work on a true story serial killer. Which I really want. Like, it's so easy to just, focus on like the kills themselves and the details and get lost in the investigation, and the audience plays the detective. You're not playing the detective here. If anything, you're playing that person who witnesses a murder on the street, and it just sits with you, and you're trying to contemplate, why would this happen, and how did everything else in society lead up to these killings, and how did this keep going? So yeah, it's a fascinating aspect to explore, and it's such a haunting thriller that I'm gonna be thinking about for many, many days after seeing it. So yeah, that Kendrick knows how to direct a pretty damn good thriller.